Some folks say the hardest choices come quietly, when no one is watching, and the most important decisions are made in the spaces between hope and fear. Claire Whitman had learned that lesson early, standing on the frost-covered platform of Copper Creek Station with a single leather trunk at her feet, the cold morning air biting through the layers of her skirt and shawl. She glanced down the tracks where the steam from the distant stagecoach curled like smoke from an abandoned hearth, imagining the long road ahead across miles of empty prairie. The sun had just begun to touch the peaks of the distant Blue Ridge, pale light scattering across the dust of the station, and she could hear the faint whistle of the wind through the wooden slats of the platform, carrying the scent of pine and frozen earth. Her fingers pressed against the leather handle of her trunk, roughened from days of travel, and she could feel the faint tremor of anticipation and dread mingling in her chest. She had nowhere else to go, no letters left unopened, no friends waiting with advice or comfort, only the hope that the man she had been sent to marry, a stranger with a reputation as unyielding as the land he owned, would accept her presence without question. Behind her, the boards of the platform creaked under the weight of the few early risers, the faint murmur of a distant river threading through the silence, reminding her of the stillness she had carried in her own chest for so long. As she stepped forward, the hem of her calico dress brushing against the frost, she could see the outline of a rider approaching, a figure on a chestnut horse, tall, steady, and unmistakably deliberate in every movement. The sound of the horse's hooves on the hard-packed earth was like a heartbeat she hadn't realized she had stopped feeling, and when the man dismounted, his boots landing with a soft thud, the early light catching the angles of his weathered face, Claire felt a strange mixture of relief and tension. He did not rush to greet her, did not offer a smile or a nod, simply stood with his hands resting lightly on the reins, watching her as if measuring every step she took. She held her chin high, inhaled the sharp winter air, and took the final steps to meet him, feeling the cold seep into her bones, her hands gripping the handle of her trunk as if it were a lifeline. Every detail of the station, the splintered wood, the frost edging the roof, the faint trail of smoke from the distant chimney, seemed magnified, each element a reminder that this was the point of no return, the crossing from what she had known to a life defined by the choices of another. And in that quiet, suspended moment, the wind carrying the scent of earth and wood smoke, Claire Whitman realized that the story of her life was about to be rewritten, not by the letters she had carried, not by the stagecoach that had brought her here, but by the stranger standing before her, steady as the land itself, waiting for her to step into the unknown. Claire Whitman followed the man across the frost-touched prairie, the chestnut horse moving steadily over the hard-packed earth, its breath rising in soft clouds that mingled with the morning mist. Every step she took made the leather handle of her trunk press more firmly into her palm, the weight of it grounding her in the strange new world she was entering. The distant hills rolled in gentle slopes, painted with the pale light of the rising sun, and the bare branches of cottonwoods swayed silently in the cold breeze. She noticed the subtle rhythm of the horse beneath her, the shift of its hooves over frozen dirt, the soft creak of leather against wood, and it reminded her that even in unfamiliar places, steady things could be trusted. The man, Silas Hart, did not speak, his eyes scanning the horizon with a quiet vigilance, every line of his posture precise, measured, and patient, as if he had been counting the miles and the minutes for years before today. Claire kept her gaze low, observing the tracks left by the stagecoach the previous evening, the patterns of frost on the prairie grass, the tiny shards of ice that caught the sunlight and sparkled like fragments of glass. They reached the edge of a small ravine where a creek cut a narrow path through the earth, the water half frozen, moving slowly, carrying reflections of pale sky and scattered clouds. Silas guided the horse down a shallow incline, carefully placing each hoof step to avoid loose stones, and Claire held her breath, feeling her heart beat. In time with the animal, aware of the cold pressing through her gloves and the stiffness in her fingers from the long ride. When they reached the far side, a wooden fence appeared, leaning slightly, its paint faded and cracking from winter weather, a gate hanging ajar that creaked gently in the wind. Silas dismounted without a word and took the reins, leading the horse through the gate and toward a small cluster of buildings that made up the ranch, the largest of them a two-story cabin with smoke curling faintly from the chimney, promising warmth and light within. Claire stepped down carefully, feeling the crunch of frost beneath her boots, and followed Silas to the cabin, noting the precise arrangement of tools and stacked firewood, the care with which everything had been placed, the quiet order of a place that had been lived in and respected. He paused at the doorway, glancing over his shoulder with a subtle nod for her to enter first, and she crossed the threshold into a space filled with the scent of pine, wood smoke, and something faintly sweet, perhaps the remains of a breakfast prepared the previous day. The cabin was modest but solid, with a cast-iron stove in the corner, a wooden table with 2 chairs, and shelves lined with jars, tins, and neatly folded cloths. Claire set her trunk down, listening to the faint settling noises of the house, the floorboards groaning softly under the weight of movement, the wind murmuring outside. Silas watched her, his expression unreadable but attentive, as if every small gesture she made carried weight, and she realized that in this quiet, deliberate observation, trust was being built without a single word. She walked to the window, brushing a thin layer of frost from the glass, and looked out over the ranch, the rolling hills stretching into the distance, dotted with skeletal trees and fences that disappeared into the horizon. The sun climbed higher, illuminating the pale landscape and the small cabin with a soft, golden glow. Claire inhaled deeply, letting the crisp air fill her lungs, feeling a fragile sense of possibility stir inside her. This was a place of work and waiting, of patience and attention to detail, and though it was unfamiliar, she understood that every action here mattered. Every gesture of care and diligence could shape the day, and perhaps in time, the life she would build alongside Silas Hart. Claire Whitman set her trunk carefully against the far wall and took a slow step further into the cabin, her eyes tracing the neat rows of shelves, the cast-iron stove still cool from the night, and the faint smell of pine mingled with the lingering warmth of a fire long extinguished. She ran her fingers lightly over the table, feeling the smoothness of the worn wood, and noticed the small imperfections, tiny scratches and dents that told stories of daily life and steady hands. Silas Hart moved around the cabin silently, tending to a few simple tasks, stacking firewood with measured care, his movements deliberate, each placement precise, and Claire observed quietly, absorbing the rhythm of his routine, the calm patience that seemed to settle the space around him. Outside, the frost had begun to melt in patches where the sun touched the earth, and the faint sound of a creek trickling through the property added a gentle undertone to the morning. Claire walked to the window, peering through the glass at the rolling hills and the distant outline of the barn, noting the way the light played across the frost and the long shadows of the trees stretching toward the cabin. She turned back to see Silas checking the condition of the tools, his hands moving confidently over hammers and saws, arranging them neatly, and she felt a sense of ease despite the unfamiliar surroundings, understanding that the careful order of the ranch reflected the care and attention he brought to every aspect of his life. Gathering herself, Claire began to unpack a few of her belongings, setting them on the table in a quiet, deliberate manner, each item placed with purpose, a folded cloth here, a small tin of herbs there, showing a quiet confidence and respect for the space she had been welcomed into. Silas glanced up briefly, noting her movements, his eyes lingering on her hands as they worked, the steady way she unfolded and arranged, and for the first time, there was a faint acknowledgement, a softening in his stance, the subtle recognition of her presence and her care. Claire moved toward the small loft above, assessing the narrow space that had been prepared for her, noting the simplicity of the bedding, the faint warmth from the morning sun filtering through the window, and she carefully arranged a few personal items, creating a small corner of home within this vast, empty space. The cabin felt less foreign with each small action, the quiet hum of life slowly weaving between them, punctuated by the occasional sound of the horse shifting in the stable outside or the soft creak of a floorboard. Claire paused to look around, taking in the details, the small shelves with neatly stacked supplies, the gentle curve of the hearth, the tools hanging in order along the wall, and felt a growing sense of belonging, a subtle thread connecting her to the ranch and to Silas, the space gradually filling with a shared rhythm and unspoken understanding. She settled at the table with a deep breath, feeling the warmth of the cabin and the potential of the day ahead, ready to begin learning the routines, to find her place within the patterns of work and care, and to discover, in the silent exchanges and measured movements, the quiet ways in which trust and connection could grow, shaping the days to come with deliberate, tender attention. Silas Hart moved through the cabin with the quiet precision of someone who had spent a lifetime shaping order from the chaos of the land, his eyes noting every detail. The way the morning light fell across the wooden beams and dust motes danced in the air, catching on the edges of shelves and tools. Claire Whitman watched him from the table, her hands resting lightly on the rough surface, feeling the warmth of the wood beneath her palms and the faint vibration of movement in the floorboards as he shifted from task to task. She noticed the careful way he handled each item, the attention he paid to alignment and balance, and it made her think that even the smallest gestures carried meaning here, that the ranch was an extension of his steadiness and care. The sun climbed higher, warming the cabin through the eastern window, and the air began to carry the soft scent of pine and earth, mingled with the lingering aroma of the morning fire. Claire rose, moving to the stove to prepare a simple breakfast, laying out bread, butter, and eggs she had kept warm, her movements deliberate and calm, each action a quiet assertion of her presence and contribution. Silas paused, his attention caught by the faint sound of utensils and the soft rhythm of preparation, glancing toward her without a word, his eyes lingering for a moment on her hands, calloused and steady, before returning to the tasks at hand. Claire placed 2 plates on the table, aligning them carefully, and set the food with a small, thoughtful precision, the steam rising in gentle tendrils, carrying warmth into the cool cabin. She poured water into a tin cup and left it for Silas, noticing the subtle way he straightened at the gesture, the slight acknowledgement in the tilt of his head, before he continued to arrange the tools and supplies, his movements smooth and confident. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, carrying the sound of a distant creek and the faint rustle of dry leaves, a reminder of the vastness of the land surrounding them and the quiet responsibilities it held. Claire paused at the doorway, feeling the warmth of the cabin behind her and the crisp air against her face, and took a slow, steady breath, aware of the rhythm of the ranch and the silent communication building between them, the trust forming not in words but in actions, in attentiveness, in the careful consideration of each moment. Silas looked up, meeting her gaze for the briefest moment, a hint of acknowledgement passing between them, unspoken yet unmistakable, before he bent again to check the alignment of a stack of firewood, his presence a steady anchor in the soft, ambient light. Claire returned to the table, arranging a small cloth and utensils for herself, taking care to move gently and deliberately, aware that her contribution mattered, that her presence in the space was being noted and valued. The quiet settled around them like a shared rhythm, each sound, the scrape of wood, the soft clink of tin, the faint creak of the floorboards, becoming a part of the unspoken conversation between them, the start of a pattern that would shape their days together, teaching them both that care, attention, and deliberate action could speak more profoundly than words ever could. The morning stretched into midday with a quiet steadiness, the kind that settled into the bones and made time feel slower, more deliberate, as if every hour carried weight. Claire Whitman stepped outside with a small basket in hand, the wood handle smooth beneath her fingers, and paused on the porch to take in the land again, the way the sunlight now softened the frost into damp earth, the way the distant hills seemed less severe under the pale blue sky. She noticed the barn more closely this time, its structure sturdy but worn, the boards weathered by years of wind and sun, and the gate slightly misaligned where it met the post. Silas Hart was already there, working along the fence line, his sleeves rolled, his hands moving with quiet purpose as he checked each rail, pressing them into place, testing their strength with a firm, practiced touch. Claire made her way toward him, her boots sinking slightly into the thawing ground, the scent of damp soil rising faintly with each step. She did not interrupt, only watched for a moment, taking in the rhythm of his work, the way he paused to consider before adjusting anything, the patience that guided every motion. When she reached the barn, she set her basket down and began to gather scattered pieces of loose wood near the entrance, stacking them neatly against the wall, aligning them in a way that felt natural, steady, and careful. Silas glanced over, his gaze lingering briefly as he noticed her actions, the way she did not rush, the way she worked as if she had always belonged to such a place. The horse shifted nearby, its hooves pressing softly into the earth, and Claire moved with quiet awareness, brushing a hand along its side in a calm, steady gesture, her touch light but sure, as if reassuring both the animal and herself. The wind carried a low sound from the far fields, the faint rustle of dry grass bending under its path, and Claire turned her attention to the barn door, noticing the hinge that hung slightly uneven. Without hesitation, she reached for a small tool resting nearby and adjusted it carefully, tightening the loose fitting with slow, deliberate turns, her brow slightly furrowed in concentration. Silas stepped closer then, not to correct her, but to observe, his presence steady beside her, and when she finished, he tested the door himself, opening and closing it with a soft creak that now settled into place more cleanly than before. There was a brief pause, the kind that carried more meaning than words, and he gave a small nod, subtle but certain, before turning back toward the fence line. Claire picked up her basket again, moving through the space with growing confidence, gathering small tasks as she went, aligning tools, clearing pathways, bringing a quiet sense of order that mirrored his own. The sun climbed higher, casting longer light across the ranch, and the sounds of the day began to fill the air more fully, the distant call of a bird, the soft shifting of wood, the quiet presence of two people working side by side without needing to speak. Claire paused once more, resting her hand against the barn's weathered surface, feeling the rough texture beneath her palm, and allowed herself a small breath, a moment of recognition that something here was beginning to take shape, not loudly, not all at once, but in small, steady movements that spoke of care, effort, and the beginning of something that could last. By late afternoon, the light over the ranch had softened into a quiet gold that stretched across the fields and settled gently along the fence lines, and Claire Whitman found herself moving through the yard with a growing sense of familiarity, her steps more certain, her hands more confident in the work she had begun to understand. The basket she carried was lighter now, filled with only a few small tools and a folded cloth, and she paused near the water trough where the surface reflected the sky in pale ripples, broken only by the slow movement of the horse lowering its head to drink. She dipped the cloth into the water, wringing it out carefully, and began to wipe down the edge of the trough, clearing away the thin layer of dust that had gathered there, her movements steady and unhurried. Silas Hart approached from the far side of the yard, the faint crunch of his boots against the gravel marking his presence before she saw him, and she glanced up briefly, meeting his gaze for a moment that held neither question nor expectation, only quiet acknowledgement. He carried a length of rope coiled over his shoulder, the fibers worn smooth from use, and as he passed, he set it down on a wooden post with a deliberate motion, adjusting it so that it hung neatly, free of tangles. Claire noticed the care in that small act, the way even something as simple as rope was treated with attention, and she mirrored that care in her own task, smoothing the cloth along the wood, ensuring each surface was clean and clear. The air carried the scent of warm earth now, the frost fully gone, replaced by the subtle richness of soil and sun, and somewhere beyond the ridge, a bird called out, its sound echoing softly across the open land. Claire moved toward the porch again, setting the cloth aside and gathering a few loose boards that had shifted near the steps, aligning them carefully, testing each one with her foot before pressing it firmly into place. Silas watched from a short distance, his arms resting loosely at his sides, his expression unchanged but his attention unmistakably present, and when she finished, he stepped forward to test the step himself, placing his weight down slowly, then nodding once, the gesture small but certain. Claire felt a quiet warmth settle in her chest at that simple confirmation, not spoken but understood, and she turned toward the door, pushing it open with a gentle hand, the hinges now moving more smoothly after her earlier adjustments. Inside, the cabin held the warmth of the day, the light filtering through the window and casting soft shadows across the table, where two plates still sat from the morning, untouched but ready, as if waiting for the next shared moment. Claire moved to the stove, placing a small pot on the surface and adding water, her hands moving with a natural rhythm, and she listened as the faint crackle of kindling began to rise, the fire catching slowly beneath her careful tending. Silas stepped inside a moment later, removing his hat and placing it on the same peg by the door, the motion practiced and consistent, and he paused as he noticed the small changes she had made, the cleared surfaces, the aligned tools, the quiet order that now filled the space. He did not comment, but he remained there for a moment longer than before, his presence lingering in the doorway, as if considering something unspoken. Claire poured water into 2 cups, setting one near the edge of the table where he usually stood, and returned to the stove, her movements calm and deliberate. The silence between them was no longer empty, but filled with the soft sounds of shared work, the low hum of a day settling into evening, and the quiet understanding that something steady was beginning to take root, not through words, but through the careful, consistent acts that spoke of trust, of presence, and of a place slowly becoming home. Evening settled over the ranch in a slow, quiet way, the sky stretching wide and open with streaks of amber fading into deep blue, and the air carried a gentle chill that hinted at the night to come. Claire Whitman stood near the edge of the yard, her shawl pulled closer around her shoulders, watching as the last of the light touched the tops of the distant hills before slipping away. The day had passed in steady work, each task folding into the next, and now there was a stillness that felt different from the morning, softer somehow, as if the land itself had exhaled. She turned at the sound of movement behind her, noticing Silas Hart approaching from the barn, his steps measured as always, but slower now, the weight of the day visible in the set of his shoulders. He carried a small bucket in one hand, the faint slosh of water marking each step, and as he passed her, he paused just briefly, his gaze shifting toward the horizon where the last light lingered. Claire followed his gaze, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence between them filled not with distance, but with a shared awareness of the quiet beauty around them. The wind moved gently through the trees, carrying the scent of cooling earth and wood smoke, and Claire felt something shift inside her, a small, almost imperceptible change, like a door opening just slightly. She stepped forward, reaching for the bucket without thinking, her fingers brushing lightly against his as she took hold of the handle, and for a fraction of a second, the contact lingered, warm against the cool evening air. Silas did not pull away, but his hand stilled, the motion pausing as if time itself had slowed, and then he released the handle, allowing her to carry it the rest of the way to the porch. Claire set it down carefully, her movements steady despite the faint awareness of that brief touch, and she turned back toward him, unsure of what to say, or if anything needed to be said at all. He stood a few feet away, his hands resting at his sides, his expression unchanged but his eyes softer, the sharpness of earlier replaced with something quieter, more thoughtful. She gestured toward the cabin, a simple motion, an invitation without words, and he nodded once, stepping forward to follow her inside. The cabin welcomed them with warmth, the fire she had started earlier now glowing softly, casting flickering light across the walls and the table where 2 plates had been set, waiting. Claire moved to the stove, lifting the lid of the pot, the steam rising gently, carrying the scent of a simple meal, and she glanced over her shoulder to see Silas standing near the door, his hat already placed on its peg, his attention fixed on the table, on the 2 plates arranged with care. He walked over slowly, pulling out the chair without a word, but instead of sitting, he waited, his hand resting lightly on the back of it. Claire hesitated for a moment, then took her place at the table, and only then did he sit across from her, the movement quiet but deliberate. They ate in silence, the soft clink of utensils and the faint crackle of the fire filling the space between them, but the silence had changed, no longer heavy or uncertain, but calm, almost steady, like the rhythm of the land outside. At one point, Claire reached for the cup near his plate, refilling it without asking, her hand steady, and he watched her for a brief moment before nodding slightly, a gesture so small it might have been missed if she had not been paying attention. When the meal was finished, neither of them moved right away, the warmth of the fire and the quiet of the evening holding them in place, and Claire realized that something had shifted, not in a grand or obvious way, but in the smallest of moments, in a shared glance, in a touch that lingered just a second longer than expected, in the simple act of waiting for the other before beginning. And as the fire burned low and the night settled fully around the cabin, she understood that these were the moments that mattered, the ones that built something lasting, something steady, something that felt, for the first time in a long while, like it might become home. The night passed with a quiet stillness that settled deep into the walls of the cabin, and when morning came, it arrived not with urgency, but with a slow, steady light that crept across the floorboards and warmed the edges of the table, where 2 plates had been left to dry. Claire Whitman rose before the sun had fully cleared the hills, her movements careful, almost instinctive now, as she stirred the embers in the stove and added kindling, coaxing the fire back to life with small, deliberate motions. The air inside the cabin carried a faint chill, but it softened quickly as the warmth spread, and she set water to boil, the soft sound of it beginning to fill the quiet. Outside, a thin layer of mist clung low to the ground, drifting over the fields and around the fence posts, blurring the distance into something softer, less defined. Claire stepped onto the porch, pulling her shawl tighter, and noticed something that had not been there the day before, a section of the fence along the eastern edge of the property where one of the rails had shifted, leaving a small gap just wide enough to matter. She paused, studying it, the way the wood leaned slightly, the nails loosened by time and weather, and without hesitation, she moved toward it, her boots brushing through the damp grass. The ground gave slightly beneath her feet, and the scent of wet earth rose with each step, steady and grounding. She knelt beside the fence, running her fingers along the wood, testing its strength, her brow furrowing as she considered the best way to secure it. The tool she had seen the day before came to mind, and she rose, returning quickly to the barn to retrieve a hammer and a handful of nails, her steps more confident than they had been even the day before. When she returned, she set to work with quiet focus, aligning the rail carefully, pressing it into place, and tapping the nails in with measured strikes, each movement controlled, each adjustment precise. The sound carried lightly across the field, not loud, but steady, and it was enough to draw Silas Hart's attention from the far side of the yard where he had begun his own morning tasks. He walked toward her, his pace unhurried but attentive, and stopped a few feet away, watching as she finished securing the rail, testing it once more with a firm hand. Claire stood, brushing her hands together, the faint dust of wood clinging to her palms, and turned to face him, meeting his gaze with quiet assurance. He stepped forward then, placing his hand against the rail, applying pressure, testing its hold, and for a moment, there was only the shared focus on the work, the solidness of the wood beneath his hand, the steadiness of her effort evident in the result. He looked at her then, really looked, his eyes taking in the details, the slight flush in her cheeks from the cold, the determination in her posture, the calm certainty in the way she stood her ground. There was no surprise in his expression, only a slow recognition, a shift that settled deeper than words. He gave a small nod, more deliberate than before, and stepped back, leaving the fence as she had set it. Claire picked up the tools, her grip steady, and walked back toward the barn, the mist beginning to lift around her as the sun rose higher, casting light across the repaired rail, the wood catching the brightness in a way that made it stand out just slightly from the rest. It was a small change, easy to overlook, but it held, firm and certain, and as Claire moved through the yard, returning the tools to their place, she felt it clearly, the first undeniable moment where her presence had not just been accepted, but had made a difference, shaping the land in a way that would remain long after the morning passed. The sun rose higher over the ranch, lifting the last of the morning mist and revealing the land in sharper lines. Every fence post, every worn path, every weathered board standing clear under the pale blue sky, and Claire Whitman moved through it with a steadiness that had not been there when she first arrived, her steps now guided by a growing sense of purpose. She carried a small tin pail from the well, the handle cool against her fingers, water sloshing softly with each step, and as she crossed the yard, she noticed Silas Hart standing near the far edge of the pasture, his attention fixed on something beyond the fence line. His posture was still, but there was a tension in it, subtle yet present, like a thread pulled tight. Claire slowed her pace, following his line of sight, and saw it then, a section of the pasture where the grass had thinned, the earth beneath it dry and uneven, a sign that something beneath the surface was not holding as It should. She set the pail down near the fence and walked closer, her boots pressing into the soil, feeling the difference beneath her weight, the way it shifted slightly, lacking the firmness of the rest of the ground. Silas glanced at her, his expression guarded, as if weighing whether to speak, but he said nothing, only gestured faintly toward the patch of land. Claire knelt, pressing her palm against the soil, brushing aside the top layer, and her fingers traced the faint outline of what had once been a narrow water channel, now partially blocked, its path disrupted by fallen debris in time. She looked up at him, meeting his gaze with quiet certainty, then returned her attention to the ground, clearing away small stones and compacted dirt with careful, deliberate movements. The work was slow, the earth stubborn in places, but she continued, her hands steady, her focus unwavering, and after a few minutes, a faint trickle of water began to move through the channel again, subtle at first, then more certain as the path cleared. The sound was soft, almost easy to miss, but it carried a quiet promise, the kind that spoke of gradual change rather than sudden transformation. Silas stepped closer, crouching beside her, his hand hovering over the ground before pressing lightly against the soil, testing its firmness, feeling the shift as the moisture returned. He did not speak, but his presence changed, the tension easing slightly, replaced by something more thoughtful, more open. Claire leaned back on her heels, brushing the dirt from her hands, her breath steady, her eyes scanning the small channel as it continued to carry water through the land, restoring a balance that had been quietly slipping away. For a moment, they both remained there, side by side, watching the slow movement of water through earth, the simple, steady flow that would, over time, bring life back to that patch of ground. Silas stood first, his movements deliberate, and offered his hand without a word, not as a command, but as an acknowledgement. Claire hesitated only briefly before placing her hand in his, the contact firm and grounded, and he helped her to her feet, releasing her hand just as steadily as he had taken it. The moment passed without comment, but it lingered in the air between them, carried in the quiet understanding that what she had done mattered, not in a grand or immediate way, but in the slow, lasting way that shaped the land and the life built upon it. Claire picked up the pail again, the water inside now reflecting the brightening sky, and as she turned back toward the cabin, she felt it clearly, the shift not just in the soil beneath her feet, but in the space between them, where something once uncertain had begun to take hold, steady and real, like water finding its way home. The day stretched onward beneath a wide, open sky, and by mid-afternoon the ranch carried a different kind of energy, quieter on the surface yet fuller beneath, as if the land itself had begun to respond to the small changes made upon it. Claire Whitman moved between the cabin and the yard with a rhythm that now felt natural, her hands no longer hesitant as they worked, her eyes noticing details she might have missed before, the way the light fell across the fence lines, the subtle shifts in the ground where moisture had begun to return, the quiet signs of life adjusting. Near the eastern pasture, the narrow channel she had cleared that morning now carried a steady ribbon of water, small but persistent, winding its way through the dry patch and softening the soil along its path. The change was not dramatic, not something that would draw attention from a distance, but it was enough to alter the way the earth held together, enough to promise that the grass there might recover, that the land would not continue to weaken in silence. Silas Hart stood at the edge of that same pasture again, his gaze lowered toward the ground, his hands resting loosely at his sides, but there was something different in the way he stood now, less guarded, more contemplative, as if he were seeing the place with new eyes. Claire approached slowly, carrying a small bundle of twine and tools, her steps steady, and she paused beside him without speaking, following his line of sight to the thin stream of water moving through the soil. The faint sound of it, almost like a whisper, carried in the still air, and for a moment neither of them moved, both aware of the quiet significance of what had begun there. Silas crouched, pressing his hand into the earth again, feeling the dampness that had returned, the firmness beginning to take hold, and he exhaled slowly, a breath that seemed to carry more than the weight of the day. Claire knelt beside him, her fingers brushing lightly along the edge of the channel, guiding a small obstruction aside to keep the flow steady, her touch careful, almost instinctive. He watched her then, Not just the movement of her hands, but the intention behind them, the quiet confidence, the way she understood the land without needing to speak about it. When he stood, he did not step away immediately, but remained close, his presence steady beside her. And after a moment, he reached down, adjusting a section of the channel she had not yet touched, his movements mirroring hers, deliberate and thoughtful. It was the first time they had worked on the same task together in that way, not separately, not in sequence, but side by side, each action responding to the other, each movement part of the same quiet effort. The sun dipped slightly lower, casting long shadows across the pasture, and the light caught on the surface of the water, making it glimmer faintly as it moved. Claire rose, brushing the dirt from her skirt, and turned toward the cabin. But before she could take more than a step, Silas spoke, his voice low and steady, carrying only a few simple words. He said that the ground there had been failing for months, that he had tried to hold it together but had not found the right way, and that what she had done that morning had changed it. The words were few, but they settled deeply, not because of their length, but because of the weight behind them, the quiet admission, the acknowledgement of her place in something that mattered. Claire met his gaze, her expression calm, and gave a small nod, not as an answer, but as a shared understanding, and then she turned back toward the cabin, the sound of the water continuing behind her, steady and certain, like a promise that would carry forward into the days ahead, shaping not just the land, but the life they were beginning to build together. The evening came softer than the one before, as if the land itself had learned something from the day, and the light that settled over the ranch carried a quiet warmth that lingered longer along the edges of the fields and the wooden rails. Claire Whitman stood at the porch with her hands resting lightly on the railing, watching as the last of the sunlight traced the path of the small water channel now weaving through the pasture, the faint glimmer of it visible even from a distance. The air held the scent of earth that had been turned and touched, a subtle change that spoke of care rather than time, and she felt it settle within her, the understanding that what had been done here would remain, long after the moment had passed. Behind her, the cabin door opened with a soft creak, and Silas Hart stepped out, his presence steady but no longer distant, his steps quieter as he came to stand beside her, not close enough to crowd, but near enough that the space between them felt shared rather than separate. He did not speak at first, his gaze following hers toward the pasture, toward the place where the land had begun to hold again, and when he finally shifted his weight, it was not away, but slightly closer, a small adjustment that carried more meaning than words. Claire did not turn, but she was aware of it, the subtle change, the way his presence no longer felt like something she had to measure, but something she could lean into without effort. The wind moved gently through the yard, brushing against the edges of her shawl, carrying the faint sound of the creek and the distant rustle of trees, and in that quiet, she heard it clearly, the difference in the silence between them, no longer uncertain, no longer waiting, but steady, like the land after rain. Silas rested his hand briefly against the railing, the wood worn smooth beneath his fingers, and then, after a moment, he spoke, not about the work, not about the ranch, but about the years before, about how the land had slowly begun to fail in small ways that were easy to overlook, how he had tried to hold it together on his own, fixing what he could, waiting for what he could not, and how it had never quite been enough. His voice was low, even, without strain, but there was something in it that had not been there before, not weakness, not regret, but a quiet honesty that settled into the space between them. Claire listened without interrupting, her gaze still on the horizon, her hands still against the railing, and when he finished, she turned slightly, just enough to meet his eyes, her expression calm, steady, as if what he had said had not surprised her, but had simply confirmed what she already understood. She did not answer with words, only with a small nod, a simple acknowledgement that she had heard him, that she saw him in the same way she had seen the land, not as something broken, but as something that could be tended, carefully, patiently, until it held again. The moment lingered, quiet and unforced, and then she moved back inside, the door opening to the warmth of the cabin, the soft glow of the fire already lit, the table set once more with 2 plates waiting. Silas followed a moment later, his steps unhurried, and as he reached the table, he paused, his hand resting briefly on the back of the chair, his gaze moving from the plates to Claire and back again, as if taking in the simple arrangement as something more than routine. He pulled out the chair and waited, just as he had the night before, and when she sat, he took his place across from her, the quiet pattern repeating, but with a difference that could be felt in the air, in the way he remained at the table a moment longer before beginning, in the way his eyes lifted to meet hers more than once, not searching, not questioning, but simply present. The fire crackled softly, the light shifting across the room, and as they ate, the silence held a new weight, not of distance, but of something forming, something steady and real, built not in grand gestures, but in the accumulation of small, deliberate acts, in the willingness to stay, to listen, to share the quiet spaces without needing to fill them. And Claire understood then that what had begun in the soil outside was now taking root here as well, in the warmth of the cabin, in the space between two people learning, slowly, how to belong. Morning came with a quiet brightness that felt different from the days before, the kind of light that did not just touch the land but seemed to settle into it, warming the ground more deeply, lingering along the edges of the pasture where the water now moved. In a steady, narrow path, Claire Whitman stepped out onto the porch with a tin cup in her hand, the warmth of it pressing gently into her palms, and paused to take in the sight. The way the grass along the channel had already begun to lift slightly, no longer brittle, no longer giving way beneath its own weight. The air carried a softer scent now, less dry, more alive, and she could hear the faint, continuous sound of water moving through the earth, quiet but certain. Behind her, the door opened, and Silas Hart stepped out, his presence no longer marked by distance, but by a steadiness that felt close, familiar. He stood beside her, not speaking, his gaze following the same line across the pasture, and after a moment, he reached out, not to point, not to direct, but simply to adjust the edge of her shawl where it had slipped slightly from her shoulder, the gesture brief, careful, and unspoken. Claire stilled for just a second, aware of the touch, of the quiet intention behind it, and then she continued as before, lifting the cup to her lips, the warmth of the coffee grounding her in the moment. They stood like that for a while, side by side, the silence no longer something to navigate, but something to share, as natural as the land stretching out before them. Later, as the day unfolded, they worked together without needing to divide tasks, moving through the ranch with a rhythm that had begun to align, Claire carrying tools to where they were needed before he asked, Silas adjusting his pace to match hers without thinking, each aware of the other in a way that did not interrupt, but supported. At the far end of the pasture, where the channel curved slightly, Claire knelt again, smoothing the edges, guiding the flow, and Silas stood nearby, handing her what she needed before she reached for it, his movements quiet, his attention steady. When she finished, she looked up at him, the sunlight catching in her eyes, and there was a moment there, a pause that held more than the work between them, something softer, something that had been building slowly, now close enough to feel. He extended his hand again, but this time not just to help her up, but to linger a fraction longer, his grip firm but gentle, his eyes meeting hers without hesitation. Claire did not pull away quickly, her hand remaining in his for that extra moment, the contact warm, steady, and certain, and when she finally stepped back, the space between them felt changed, not smaller, but closer, more connected. As the afternoon light stretched across the land, they returned to the cabin together, their steps unhurried, the path familiar now beneath their feet. Inside, the table was set once more, 2 plates placed with care, the fire already burning low and steady, and Claire moved to the stove while Silas hung his hat in its place, the routine repeating, but with a quiet ease that had not been there before. When they sat to eat, the silence carried a warmth that matched the fire, their movements unspoken but shared, each waiting for the other without needing to think about it. And in that simple, steady rhythm, in the small gestures that passed between them without words, it became clear that what had begun as necessity had grown into something else entirely, something rooted not just in the land they worked, but in the quiet understanding they were building together, day by day, moment by moment, until it no longer felt like 2 separate lives meeting, but one life taking shape, steady and whole. The days that followed did not arrive with any grand announcement, but they carried a quiet certainty that settled into every corner of the ranch, into the worn boards of the cabin, into the soil that now held moisture where it once had not, and into the steady rhythm that Claire Whitman and Silas Hart had come to share without needing to name it. Morning light stretched across the pasture in soft gold, catching on the narrow ribbon of water that continued to move through the land, no longer a fragile line, but something that held its course with quiet confidence. Claire stood at the edge of it, her hands resting loosely at her sides, watching the way the grass had begun to return, thin at first, but present, alive in a way it had not been before. The air carried the scent of growth now, subtle but unmistakable, and she felt it in the same way she felt the warmth of the sun on her face, steady and real. Behind her, the sound of footsteps approached, familiar in their pace, and Silas came to stand beside her, not as a stranger measuring distance, but as someone who knew exactly where to stand, close enough that the silence between them felt shared, not empty. He did not speak, and neither did she, but their attention settled on the same place, the same small stretch of land that had changed, and in that shared focus, there was an understanding that went deeper than words. After a moment, he reached out, not toward the land, but toward her, his hand brushing lightly against hers before settling there, his fingers steady, his touch unhurried, as if it belonged there. Claire did not move away, her hand remaining in his, the contact simple, grounded, and certain, and she turned slightly to look at him, her expression calm, her eyes reflecting the same quiet certainty that had taken root around them. He held her gaze for a moment, and then gave a small nod, not as a question, not as a request, but as a recognition of what had already begun, something that did not need to be spoken to be understood. Together, they turned back toward the cabin, their steps falling into the same easy rhythm, the path familiar now, the distance shorter than it had ever felt. The porch creaked softly beneath their weight as they stepped inside, the door closing behind them with a gentle sound, and the cabin welcomed them with warmth, the fire already lit, the table set with 2 plates, the simple arrangement no longer just preparation, but expectation. Claire moved to the stove, lifting the lid of a pot as steam rose in soft curls, and Silas crossed to the window, pausing for a moment to look out over the land before returning to the table, pulling out a chair and waiting, just as he always did. She joined him a moment later, and they sat across from each other, the quiet between them filled with the small sounds of a shared life, the clink of utensils, the low crackle of fire, the steady presence of 2 people who had learned, not through words, but through actions, how to remain. Outside, the water continued its path through the pasture, steady and sure, shaping the land in ways that would last, and inside, something just as steady had taken hold, something built from patience, from care, from the quiet decision to stay, to tend, to choose, again and again, the life they were building together. And in that stillness, in the warmth of the cabin and the soft glow of evening light, Claire understood that what had once been uncertain had become something solid, something that did not need to be proven, because it was already there, in the land, in the home, and in the space between them that now felt, without question, like where she belonged.